Hi students, I want to talk to you today and show you how to throw the first of 3 lids that we're going to be making in our ceramics class. The first lid that I want to show you and demonstrate for you is the set-in lid. It's a flat lid that's thrown directly on the bat, and it rests on the interior of the pot in what we call the flange in the gallery, okay? So here is the flange, and this impressed area is called the gallery in ceramic terms. The lid sets inside and rests on the flange. It fits snugly in there, and then you just lift it up and it sits right in there. So when we are making lidded jars, you always want to start with throwing the base of the lidded jar first. So I have a small piece of clay here. It's about 1.5 pounds. I'm going to get it started. I'm going to get the clay centered, bring it up into the cone, push the clay back down, speed up my wheel here a little bit, tuck the heel of my hand in, one more time, up, and then back down to make sure that the clay is centered, and I tuck the heel of my hand in. And you will notice that my bat is off center. Doesn't matter. As long as your clay is centered, you're good to go. So now I'm going to open up my ball of clay. I'm going to spread my floor. I'm going to squeeze my clay in a little bit. And I'm going to squeeze the top portion of my ring of clay here and thin it out before I do that big pull, that big initial pull from the bottom. Now, an important factor for making a lidded jar that has a flange set in the jar itself is to keep the rim of the flange very thick. You're gonna have to put a flange into this, and if you have a paper thin rim, you're not gonna be able to engineer a flange into the top of that. So every time that I make a pull for my lidded jar, I stop short of pulling straight through the rim. Okay, we put the dog out, the barking dog. I'm going to get the water out of the bottom, and I'm going to collar in the top of this pot, and now I'm going to come back underneath, kind of shape it up a little bit. When I think about jars, I think about what they are going to hold. Are they going to hold sugar? Are they going to hold spices? Are they going to be a salt pinch for when you're cooking? Are they going to hold your paper clips? Are they going to hold your Q-tips? What are they going to hold? So determining what the use of your jar is going to be before you make it will determine how large you make it, or the scale. Okay, so I'm just going to compress this edge a little bit, and it is time now for me to build the flange into the top of my lidded jar. The way that I do this is I take my wooden rib, the one that has a nice straight right angle on the edge of the wooden rib, and I'm going to turn that rib outwards so the point is facing out, and I'm going to divide, or what we call split the rim. And I do this by holding on to the rim of my jar and supporting it, and then I press the edge of my wooden rib down and split the rim and depress it to create the flange. This only works if you have a thick enough rim and your pot is very centered. I'm going to clean up the edge of this, compress it, and then it's also important that you don't have any standing water on the inside of your rim right here, okay? Because it'll weaken this little flange area and it'll kind of tear off sometimes inside your pot. I'm going to undercut this. And now I'm going to take a measurement. Now, these are a pair of calipers. These are used to measure lids in ceramics. You received a pair in your kit that we handed out to you as a loaner, and you use these to measure the interior of your lidded jars. Now, when we do a measurement, you want to make sure that you're pressing up against the sides of your jar, so that way you get a nice fit, a nice tight fit. So when I measure this lidded jar, I took this measurement all the way to the outside edge, and then when I threw the lid, I took the opposite side of my calipers and measured the outside edge of the lid, so I knew that the measurements were going to fit. So I have the interior measurement for this lidded jar, and you can always double check. I think this needs to be a hair bigger. Okay, and if you have these little markings, that's okay. You can rub them out later. I'm going to lift up this jar and set it aside. I'm going to grab another bat. Fix this down. Clean it off. And I have a ball of clay here that I've roughly measured out. Now, when you are making lidded jars, I don't have a specific rhyme or reason to how I measure. It's not like you have a pound of clay, so your lid must therefore be a half a pound. It really depends on the opening of the jar that you make. Here, I usually use my calipers to just size out and use my critical thinking or my sort of forward thinking about how this would shape up. If this was a lot smaller piece of clay, I would hold it in my calipers and say, I can't stretch that out to make a lid. And if it was really large and chunky, then I know that I would have a lid that would be way too big. So this is an appropriate size for the caliper measurement that I have. So I'm going to set this down on my wheel. I'm going to center up this small ball of clay, and it's not easy, but I kind of like centering a small ball of clay a little bit more than throwing on the hump, which I'm going to show you in one of the next lids. So using my fingertips, I just really carefully center this ball of clay. Let me find my sponge here. And I'm going to compress this down and spread it out. Now, When I spread out this ball of clay, I'm not going to push down in the middle because I need to create a knob. So I press just on the outside of the middle, and then a little bit of clay raises up from the middle, which I will then articulate into a knob in a moment. So I press this down, and I like to use my sponge because it has a broad surface area, and I feed the clay out into the bat. I get my calipers and I take a measurement. Now, this is a little bit bigger than it should be to fit into my lidded jar. And that's okay because we can always trim in later to fit. But you can't add clay to bring it out wider. Otherwise, your lid will just drop into your jar. So if it's a little bit wider, that's not a big deal. Now that I have the width of the lid set, I can start to come in and use my fancy finger work to gently articulate a nice knob for the top of my jar. I use my fingertips a lot to do this, and one thing that I'm concentrating on a lot is creating an undercut underneath my knob, so that way my fingers will hook underneath this and I can lift it up. There's nothing more disappointing than having just like a little nubbin on the top of your lid that you can't grasp. Having something elegant, almost like an upside down raindrop, is really, really nice. So this looks really sweet. It looks refined. It has a nice undercut. It looks like the knob flows right down and has a nice form into the neck and then into the flat part of the lid. Okay, one last measurement check. Good. I'm still a hair bigger than the measurement of my calipers, which is good. I can always trim it down just a little bit, which is what we want. And I'll clean that up. And because we're throwing on plaster bats, we don't have to use our wires. I'll pop this off, and then a little bit, I'll trim this for you, and you'll be able to see how these two pieces come together.